So I've said this before, but I'll say it many times more. I think one of the basic problems of our society and lots of us in life is that we've got what I call Nickelback disease. Right? Do you remember that song by Nickelback, Rockstar? And it says about all the people who are disappointed with life. And what is it? Life hasn't turned out quite the way you want it to be. And that is often people's lives. But I think often for us as Christians, if we're following Jesus, that's how we think about the Christian life. Because somebody told us, or we heard, even if they didn't, that if we trust Jesus, life would get better. Right? Life would be fun. Jesus would bring meaning and satisfaction and joy and all those things. And what we've actually discovered is that life got harder when we trusted Jesus. Life has become war. We're fighting against the devil. We're fighting against our own sinful flesh. We're fighting against the world around us in rebellion against Jesus. And perhaps for some of us, we're getting tired of fighting. Perhaps for some of us, we don't want to hear that life is brutal. We don't want to hear that life is war. We'd quite like a few weeks off, thanks, and just some nice, cheerful bunnies and rabbits and rainbows and fluffy stuff. Unlucky. Because here's the question John's asking us. In this war of a life, and we are at war, the Bible's really clear about that, we're going to think about that more. In this war of a life, is Jesus enough for us to endure? The question he's asking us is, why bother if following Jesus makes life harder? And you know the answer he gives us? Because he's worth it. John wants to help us see here that Jesus is worth it. That the end is worth it, and that by his grace we can endure. And he does that by showing us yet another angle. He's looking at it again from another perspective on this war of a life. Remember last week we'd seen that Jesus is reigning, the Lord is reigning over all things, and Jesus is worthy to open the scroll, which is history and God's judgment on the world. And so, as we look at this war of a life, John lifts our eyes and says, number one, shift your perspective. Because we've probably all seen them, right? Those illusion pictures. You look at a picture and it's like, do you see an old woman or do you see a young woman? And apparently it depends like how crazy you are, which one you see or something. I don't really understand it. But once you've seen one, it's hard to see the other, right? But when somebody shows you the other one, you find it hard to see the original one. Because how and where we look at things, how and where we look at our lives changes everything. Our perspective changes everything. And this whole section that we've been looking at over the last week or two is a repeat. It's another perspective on the vision John saw in chapter 1, verses 12 through to the end of chapter 3. In chapter 1, verse 12 through to 3:22, it was looking at that perspective of all the time between Jesus' resurrection and his return from the church's perspective, from an earthly perspective, from our perspective. All this section from chapter 4, verse 1 through to chapter 7, 17 that we're looking at today and last week is that same picture, but from a heavenly perspective. So the first few chapters we're looking at it from our perspective. The second one, John shifts it round and says, look at this from the Lord's perspective. In that first vision, the churches felt like evil forces were waging war against them. Do you remember we saw that hardship and suffering? We saw the attacks of the world on them through that false teaching they were receiving. They were seeing the attacks of their own sinful flesh to believe lies and indulge sin. They'd lost their first love. They lived where Satan had his throne. It looks like those evil forces are going to win the victory over them, fighting a war against them. But here, in chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, this perspective shifts because those evil forces are ones sent by Jesus in judgment on the world. Which one's true? Evil is trying to defeat God's church, and evil in the world is God's judgment on the world for its own evil. Which one's true? Both. It just depends which perspective we're looking for. Because you see John's point here in chapter 6. He's got these 4 horsemen, right? You know, literally the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. That's where this comes from, right? It's not now you see me, they're not going to do magic tricks, right? It is all of evil. These 4 horsemen, they're Jesus' means of judgment. Remember, he's opening these seals, which are God's judgment on the world. They're Jesus' means of judgment on the ungodly nations of the world, everyone, at their rebellion and sin and evil. We read that in Zechariah 1 and 6, right? Those 4 horsemen, which the 4 horses were remarkably similar colours and given remarkably similar jobs in Zechariah, right? The Lord going out from the Lord to punish the evil nations. And did you notice when Jack read us Ezekiel 14 about the 4 plagues that God put on Jerusalem in judgment on it? They're there in verse 8, look. Sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts of the earth. John's literally quoting it. So this is God's judgment on the whole earth, the pagan nations and the people of Israel. So this is God's judgment on the world, sending these evil forces. But at the same time, these evil forces are raging against the Lord and his anointed one, Jesus, in a spiritual war to try and destroy him and his people. That's verses 9 to 11. Look, as they kill and murder Christians. People differ exactly on who this rider is in verses 1 and 2. But as far as I can see, it's probably the devil going out as an angel of light, pretending to be the angel of light, the white conqueror with the sword, trying to conquer the world. And he's using verses 3 and 4, war and violence. Verses 5 and 6, he's using traditionally famine, but really oppression and poverty and people screwing other people over. He's using death and destruction, verses 7 and 8, in an attempt to destroy the Lord and his people. And it's why the Lord laughs. Kevin read it as in Psalm 2, right? The nations rage and plot in vain against the Lord and against his anointed. What does the Lord do? The Lord laughs at them. Because it is the very raging and plotting in vain of the devil and the world and our sinful flesh that the Lord uses to judge the nations in their sin. Our attempts to break the Lord's chains simply bind us more and more into eternal condemnation and judgment. This is what Paul was talking about in Romans 1:18 when he said the wrath of God is already being revealed against the evil, the sin of humanity. God's wrath, God's anger at sin is being revealed in the world by giving us a foretaste of hell now. Through him, as Paul says in Romans 1:24, giving us over to what we want. Think about it. The devil wants to destroy everything. And so the Lord will give him authority to destroy all that is evil, including himself. The world in rebellion against God rages against the Lord and his anointed. And in that raging and that violence and that anger only ends up fighting and defeating itself. Our sinful hearts go through life trying to put ourselves on the throne and look after number one. And therefore all we end up doing is causing suffering to numbers 2 to 8 billion. And ultimately eating and rotting our very souls. It's a tiny foretaste of hell. God gives us over to the evil that will eat us and kill us. And so as we look at the life that is war, life that is brutal, life that is a fight to trust Jesus, John says, get it from the right perspective. He says it's true, life is hell. Or at least a sneak preview as we barrel along together in that handcart. Life is war. If we're Christians, we live in a world that is intent on fighting everyone all at the same time. Well, we live in a broken world anyway. All of us, whether we're Christians or not. But if we are in Jesus, we also have an enemy that wants to destroy us. But if we see it from the right end, the right perspective, we see it's not those who are fighting against the Lord and his anointed who sit on the throne, who are in control. The one who is in control is the one who sends out the horsemen. The one who holds the lead, as it were. The one who holds the scroll with the plan on it. It might look like we're fighting a losing battle to keep our head above water in this fight to follow Jesus. But really, just like it was with Noah, that rising tide is coming to sweep away the evils and the sin that eats our world and our very souls. And if we get that perspective, secondly, we'll trust the Lord. Because some folks here in this church, I have this experience myself, some folks in this church are not wild about big dogs. Can find them a little bit scary, unpredictable, aggressive. But imagine you had the big, massive, barking, scary dog, and on the other end of the lead was the world's strongest man. And that dog cannot move because that man can lift a bus. A little dog is not going to pull him away, right? That dog on that lead can only do what its owner lets it do. This far, he says, and no further. It can bark, but it ain't going to get near biting you. That's the picture here, isn't it? In verses 1 and 2, we've got this devil going out, pretending to be this conqueror, pretending to be this white, lovely angel of light, pretending to be like Jesus. And he thinks he's conquering the world. He thinks he's conquering people's hearts through this deception. We've got verses 3 and 4. Those who are taking peace away from the world, the warmongers, the murderers, the abusers. They might think they can get what they want through force. Forget what it does to other people. Verses 5 and 6, just look at what happens. Verse 5, you've got this hot rider with her scales in its hand. It's all about weights and cheating and food and enough food. And then it says, look, 1 kilogram of wheat for a day's wages and 3 kilograms of barley for a day's wages. What we've got here is superinflation. Things become so expensive that people can't afford the daily basics. But look at what you don't take away. Look, the oil and the wine. The rich can still have their luxuries. People are struggling for a loaf of bread, but the rich are still swanning around eating their caviar and driving the Bentleys. And then verses 7 and 8, you've got death and destruction. The final end, all the dangers that the world might terrify us, these swords and famines and plagues and beasts and wild stuff, they might terrify us. The idea that we might be martyred for following Jesus, persecution, attack, just the rejection of other people around might literally loosen our bowels. But Jesus sits on the throne. Even when the terrors of living in a world under Jesus' judgment look like a mighty army sweeping down on us, they can only do what King Jesus says. And he, as Romans 8, 28 and 29 tell us, has got all these pieces on the board working for his glory and to mould us into the image of Jesus. You see, at those times, we got to listen to that great old preacher from the 19th century, Charles Spurgeon. I've said this before, I'll say it again, it's awesome. When we cannot trace the Master's hand, we must learn to trust his heart. When we cannot trace the Master's hand, we must learn to trust his heart. When life is war, when our health is shot and we don't know if we can go on, when our finances are in a mess, when we don't know if we'll ever find a job, when we just are terrified about the future, when it hurts like hell, will we trust that he's using it to make us fit for heaven? Calling us to depend on him, to trust him. Will we learn to trust his love for us even when we can't see what he's doing? When the shadow of past abuse or sin or trauma twists our gut and wrecks our relationships, will we only see the horror, or dependent on the Spirit, will we comfort others with the comfort we've been given? Will we learn to trust his love for us even when we can't see what he's doing? When death deprives us of loved ones, will we rage and turn away from the Lord in despair? Or as Jesus did at Lazarus' tomb, will we weep and then trust the Lord who does all things for his glory and for our good? Will we learn to trust his love for us even when we can't see what he's doing? When we're mocked and rejected and ignored and pitied and even attacked or killed for trusting Jesus, it's tempting to give in, right? To keep quiet, to privatize our faith, to water down the gospel, to rage at the world around us. Or will we keep going, learning to trust his love for us even when we can't see what he's doing? To trust the one who faced down the deception of the world, the flesh and the devil in the garden, as he prayed, not my will but yours be done, and cried, it is finished, as he conquered our sin at the cross, because he trusted his Father. The one who went into the spiritual warfare of the cross, suffering unimaginable violence, that we might have peace, because he trusted his Father. The one who was oppressed and abused and mistreated, so that he might become all the spiritual food and nourishment we need for life, because he trusted his Father. The one who took our hell and died our death as the sword of God's wrath pierced him, so that we might have his life and be made whole, because he trusted his Father. Will we learn to trust our Saviour's heart, that he holds all the forces of evil and says, this far or no further, I will use them to shape my people? Some of us have talked about before. Often we don't know what God's doing in our lives, but it's like a sculpture. You know, the sculptor gets the marble and he says, how do you make a statue? You take away everything that's not statue. How do you do that? You get a big knock-off chisel and you smash it. And that hurts, right? But what ends up is something beautiful. Will we trust our Master's hand? And if we trust our Master's hand, seeing it from his perspective, thirdly, we will live at war. Because expectation changes how and why we live, right? And whether we're prepared to endure. It's that old saying, isn't it? If forewarned is forearmed. If we know it's coming, we're better prepared for it. I was thinking about this the other day. Imagine that kid in Tesco, you know, up the road, going to Tesco on Friday night with Mum. Mum, I want an ice cream. You're not having an ice cream. Ah! Raging, right? Raging because they can't have an ice cream. Because they think they should. Imagine that same child living in Sudan or Gaza. Mum saying, look, I found a cup of rice. Wow, awesome. I'm going to eat today. Do you see? Expectation changes everything. John says, verses 1 to 11, well, verses 1 through to, 11, that we live in a war zone. But here's the problem. We think we should be able to live with a peacetime mentality. We're surprised when life is not never-ending progress and happiness. We're surprised for some bizarre reason, if we've ever read a newspaper or a history book, we're surprised when governments make decisions that cost us money or happiness. We're surprised when the rich oppress the poor. We're surprised when nutters take whole nations and regions to war for selfish reasons of their own. Well, that's never happened before. But that's what Jesus says it'll be. Here. Life is war. Life is brutal. Like God, we live under the curse of what humanity's sin has brought upon us. And if it's like that on a global scale, why should it be any different in our daily lives? People will let us down. People will hate us without cause. Worse, people hate us with cause, right? People will cheat us out of what's ours. People will purposefully misunderstand our motives and intentions. And the world and the flesh and the devil, as John says in verses 9 to 11 here, is constantly trying to drag us away from following Jesus. And if they can't drag us away from following Jesus, they'll either cut us off from polite social life as we die the death of being rejected, or in some parts of the world, they'll just kill us. Jesus is clear here. If we're following him in denying ourselves, taking up our cross and following him, we're in the middle of a spiritual war where we will be constantly, snidely, even sometimes openly attacked. And in order to persevere in that war, we will have to make immense sacrifices. We will have to be willing to give up everything and everyone, perhaps, that we treasure in order to keep clinging to Jesus. That is the Christian life. Don't let anyone tell you that if you become a Christian, your life's going to get easy. You can go on YouTube and watch the video of John giving his testimony when he got baptized. Do you remember what he said? As soon as I started reading the Bible with Graham, my life went downhill. I was like, thanks, John. But you get his point, right? He became a Christian. He realised he's in a war. The devil wasn't bothered about him before. That's the Christian life. Get used to it. It means this morning, if you feel under attack in that battle to trust Jesus, or fighting that besetting sin, or the pressure to conform from others, or whatever, if you feel under spiritual attack, and yet you're fighting to keep hold of Jesus and trust him, it doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. Because life's not easy, and therefore Jesus isn't blessing you. It means you're doing it right. Life is war. But we can fight it because Jesus is King. You know, in the Second World War, whenever anybody moaned, oh, well, I hate rationing, it's so bad, I can't have chocolate. You know what they said? There is a war on, It's to be expected, this, right? Perhaps we need to say that to one another when we moan about struggling in the Christian life. That there is a war on, Hard stuff is simply to be expected. It's part of life now. We will have to make sacrifices. We will have to fight. We will have to accept that some of the dreams our mates live for, we're never going to have because it's not what the Lord is calling us to. We will have to get battered and mocked and rejected, maybe even only verbally, if we follow Jesus. Because there's a war on. If people laughing at us is enough to put us off following Jesus, quit now because you're never going to stand the pace. Because there is a war on, it means half-hearted soldiers are not required, not acceptable. If we're like this church in Laodicea, lukewarm, and not striving after following Jesus, you're either going to get a rocket and have to change, or you're going to quit. Think about that soldier in his trench. The whistle's about to blow for him to go over the top. Unless he's got a greater cause to fight for his mates, to fight for the cause of freedom or whatever lies have been told to him, to fight for his family, to fight for safety. Unless he's got that greater cause, he will not get out of the trench. Unless we're fanning into flame the faith we've been given in Jesus, striving after him, pursuing him, looking to him, it's simply not worth it to find the faith of perseverance in the midst of this spiritual war. But if we get that this is life now, if this is who we're called to be in Jesus, because the Father has given us Jesus by his Spirit, who equips us to fight and endure, we can fight and endure and live for Jesus. And we can continue the fight because we know the end's coming. Because fourthly, we wait for justice. Because that's the biggest cry of our hearts when life is war, right? It's the cry of the 5-year-old. Mummy, it's not fair. That's our heart, isn't it? Kids say it and we go, life's not fair. Is that what your mum used to say to me? Same with me. I can hear her saying it now. Some of you can as well. Yeah. Life's not fair, Graham. But we don't learn that lesson as adults, right? We tell the kids, we don't learn it. It's not fair. We live in a war where attacked and mocked and constantly tempted to jack it in as the world and the flesh and the devil tell us it's not worth it. And here's the thing, it's not fair. The warmongers, the war chiefs get away with it. There's a historian wrote a book about hunting down the Nazi war criminals after the war, right? And he called it Hunting Evil. But he joked on a podcast that I listened to, it should have been called Not Hunting Evil, because they realised we desperately needed him to run Germany after the war, so they just let him get away with it, right? Most of them got away with it. That's outrageous. But that changes us, because if people get away with their sin against us, people get away with evil, we've got to fight for our rights. We've got to stand up for ourselves. We've got to bring our own brand of justice, which really is getting our own back, right? We can't live, if we are like that, transparently distinctive, loving, forgiving, sacrificially selfless lives in the midst of this war, because if we did, other people would get away with it. Just like Hitler did, just like Jimmy Savile did. No. Look at verses 12 to 17. One day, Jesus is going to say, enough is enough. Look at this in verses 12 to 14 there, the earthquake, the sky turning black. He's using pictures to say the world's going to end. Jesus is going to wrap up the world and return in judgment, right? We're going to say much more about that as we look at that in more detail next week in chapter 8, verses 1 and following. But when he returns and the world ends, look at verses 15 to 17. Everyone is going to stand before Jesus. And everyone is going to be the same. Look at it there. All people, the greatest to the least, right? The princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else. They're all, verse 16, going to be terrified, right? Hiding in the rocks, calling savers. And they're all going to be guilty. Not one person, Jesus says, will get away with the rejection of Jesus and living at war with him in rebellion and sin. Not Gaddafi, not Saddam, not Pol Pot, not Peter Sutcliffe, not your abuser, not your bully at school, not that person on Facebook last week or next week. Each and every one will be tried and found wanting, Jesus says, and sentenced to an eternity in hell. That is this war of a life on steroids. as God removes his goodness and is omnipresent in his condemnation. His wrath fully revealed. Literally, it is a fate far, far worse than death. That's why in chapter 20, verse 14, it is described as the second death. And therefore, if justice will be done, we can wait for justice to be done and not have to fight to bring that justice ourselves. Instead, entrusting ourselves to the one who judges justly. Instead of raging at the unfairness of life, we can wait for the Lord, because no one gets away with it, including me and you. Did you see that there in verse 15? The kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty. Oh, that's good. Hey, the toughs get smashed. Awesome. And everyone else, slave or free. That's quite pretty all-encompassing, right? That's what the Bible tells us. Romans 3:23. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We're all part of these nations that have raged and plotted in vain against the Lord and his anointed one, Jesus. We're all part of the destruction of the world in how we sought to live as kings of our own lives and all we survey. To live how we want, even where it damages others and rejects the goodness of God. We all will stand before a perfectly holy, righteous God and face the wrath of this God and the Lamb. And face eternity in the war of terror. Unless we come to this Lamb now as the one who has already taken that wrath on himself at the cross. As Jesus took hell that we might have life. We can't do anything in ourselves. We're sinners and rebels and terrorists against the King, but Jesus offers life. Will we come this morning asking him to save us and rescue us, forgive us? Will you bow the knee and trust Jesus? Because when we do that, we can know finally the confidence that we can rest in certain hope. Because if the one thing they used to say back in the war was like, there is a war on, the other thing was what everybody talked about. When the war is over, I will. Right? We know that experience, right? Do you remember? When COVID is over, we will. And this is all over and done with, if it ever is. That phrase, doesn't it? It gives you the strength to push through now, hoping that there will be a time when all this will be gone and it'll all be bare. And chapter 7 is that picture. It's like in brackets. So he's opened 6 seals, right? And he's getting towards the end of the world. And he's going to go back to the 7th seal, which is the 7 trumpets that we'll see next week. And talk about the end of the world and the judgment of God, right, on people who don't trust Jesus. But he just puts in brackets here what's going to happen to God's people. He wants them to see the end of the war. Because look, he says, don't do all this judgment stuff, verse 1 and 2, right? Don't smash all the earth until verse 3, look, you've put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. The servants of God are sealed. Now, let's just be really clear. This is another symbolic thing, right? This is not that God's coming with a big wax thing, put some sort of weird face tat on your head, so that we all walk around with like Jesus written on our head. It's symbolic. It's what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1:22. God has set his seal of ownership on us, in his Spirit guaranteeing what's to come. And did you notice? It's all of the servants of God. There, he put a seal on the servants of our God, verse 3. And then he explains what that looks like. Verses 4 to 8. They'll be saved. From all of the 12 tribes of spiritual Israel, there will be 12,000 people. Remember those numbers. 12 pointing to completion. As we're going to see again later, 1,000 pointing to completion. Whether Jews or Gentiles, all Jesus' people have their name written on his heart and they will be brought in. And in this way, as Paul says in Romans 11, all Israel will be saved. As all Abraham's children put their faith in the Messiah he longed for. John confirms that for us, because he's had this new vision here in chapter 1 verse 7. Remember, chapter 7 verse 1 even. Do you remember when he says after this he's introducing a new vision from a different perspective? He does it again in verse 9. Look, after this I looked. He sees the same thing from a different perspective. From God's perspective, as he seals his people, verses 1 through to 8, God looks at his people and he sees all Israel, all Jacob's children, all Jesus' servants. They're brought in as represented by the 12 patriarchs of the tribes of Israel. All Israel's sons. But when John looks from the human perspective, from our angle, verses 9 and 10, that same family doesn't just have Jewish genes, but infinitely different backgrounds and languages and skin tones and cultures. From every nation, tribe, people and language, this multitude that no one can number. Infinitely different, but only one Lord who they worship and praise and rejoice for in eternity. And who are these people praising God and singing this song? Look at verse 13. The elder says, who are they? And John says, John's like that guy, right, who's desperate not to get the wrong answer. You know. He tells him, right. They're those who are brought from this life where is war, this great tribulation. That's not something special, by the way. That's life in this world now, this war. They've been brought out of that, and they've trusted in Jesus' life and death and resurrection as their only hope of life and salvation. Because they've washed their bloods and robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Jesus has cleansed them and saved them. And now, verses 14 to 17, from Jesus' return to them, they've been brought out of this old world under judgment of chaos and disaster and death. And instead, they've been brought into a new heavens and earth where all is exactly as it's supposed to be. Just look at it there. Verse 15, they're in a perfect relationship with God, just like Adam and Eve were. As God shelters them with his presence and they serve him day and night. Verse 16, they're enjoying all his good gifts. There's no famine or oppression or hunger or thirst. There's no pain or suffering as the sun doesn't beat down with them. They enjoy his good gifts and his protection and his supply and love. As we sang in Psalm 121, he will be their keeper, their guard, their protector, their Lord and their shepherd. And he will keep them, look, verse 17, giving them, as Jesus promised that woman at the well, springs of water springing up to eternal life. And he will take away all memory of that sadness and pain and terror and despair. They'll be secure. Verses 9 to 12, did you notice? They're dressed in white, singing the same song as the angels were that we saw last week. What's John telling us here? Life is war, but Jesus wins. And he will bring us safely home. But it's just like Chicken Run. You can't see paradise, what? If you don't pedal. We want to go through life passively, just thinking everything will happen to us and we can just get on with it as best we like. Oh, Jesus, yeah, we ain't going to get there. We've got to fight, to endure, to overcome, to be victorious. That's what Jesus told those churches in those letters back in chapter 2 and 3. Not in our own strength and righteousness, but simply because we've been rescued through the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. And therefore we see things from his perspective, the right perspective. Jesus reigns. He's with us and for us. He will win and bring us safely home. Look to Jesus, look to the glory he promises, and by his grace together pedal like mad as we lift our eyes and look to our Saviour. Back to his finished work at Calvary, where despair was overrun. and forward to that final day where our God will dwell with us and be our steadfast light, and we will ever his people be. And all glory will be to Christ. Look and see Jesus. He has redeemed us. He will lead us safely home. Let's pray.